Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Tom Manuel. I am the Program Director for Driver Fitness at AMBA. And today we're going to start our webinar on first offenders. Should first offenders be required to enroll in Ignition Interlock program? We'd like you to put your phones on mute during the webinar and hold your questions at the end. Our speaker today is Dr. William Rausch. Dr. Rausch served as a statistician at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety and co-founded the Transportation Safety Research Group at Westat. He has more than 35 years of research experience and has worked in the specific area of highway safety since 1991. He co-founded the Transportation Research Division at Westat as a principal investigator at the Centers for Studies on Alcohol, Substance Abuse Research Group. He assisted or directed research projects on both the regional and national levels, including numerous studies of effectiveness of countermeasures to reduce injury and deaths on the nation's highway. His work includes evaluating Ignition Interlock license restriction programs under funding by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, the National Highway Safety Traffic Administration, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and the Maryland Department of Transportation. He is in Who's Who in America 2012 and is currently the Vice President of Research at the Association of Unmanned Vehicle Systems International in Arlington, Virginia, where he is working on Transportation Technology Transfer Initiative. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rausch, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Tom. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. To our Canadian visitors, I'd like to assure you I have my Tim Hortons coffee in front of me. Before I get started, there are many people that are responsible for this research, but I just want to cite three in particular: Ann Farrell, Tom Manuel, and Dr. Robert Raleigh. All were instrumental in the fact that we were able to conduct these studies in the state of Maryland. The research today was funded by the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, but the things that I cite today are my own personal opinion and not necessarily those of NIAAA. But we're all familiar with highway safety and the problems and the issues, and I'm not going to regurgitate data that we already know. But if we put the highway deaths in perspective, we have a fatality that occurs daily about every 12 minutes, and an alcohol-related fatality about every 30 minutes. If we had all of these fatalities occur, however, on the same day at the same time, this would be equivalent to the fatalities sustained in the World Trade Center, or otherwise a World Trade Center event happening every 23 days, and a World Trade Center event happening every 57 days of alcohol-related deaths. Or looking at a Boeing 737 that kills every passenger on board, this would be a Boeing going down about every day, every 1 day, and an alcohol-related about every 3 days. So these fatalities all don't occur at the same instance, and so we have to take measures, because if they did occur on the same day, there would be an absolutely outraged public.
I just put it on my phone.
This is why we're here. We have to continually look for new measures to reduce injuries and deaths on the nation's highways.
I want to make sure that everyone can hear the conversation. Is everyone able to hear what Dr. Rausch is saying?
Yeah, getting a little interference.
A little interference. If everyone could just keep their phones on mute, that'll put the interference down some, okay?
Today's findings actually are secondary and even tertiary analyses of research that was conducted in Maryland. It was actually came out of 3 randomized controlled trials of Ignition Interlock license restriction programs. These programs studied the program effectiveness, and in fact are the only 3 studies that have scientific validity with regard to program effectiveness. And I would just like to call out again, it was Tom Manuel, currently with AMBA, that was the field program manager for these studies. These studies, if you're not already aware, reduced recidivism, They reduced alcohol-related crashes. Under certain circumstances, they reduced total crashes, and they even reduced the number of violations, moving violations, per driver in the state of Maryland. And if you want more information about these studies, you can talk to Tom. Well, since we're going to answer several questions with regard to ignition interlock programs, I want to go over what is the current status of authorization of interlock programs currently. And currently, 6 states authorize ignition interlock programs for multiple offenders. 15 states and 4 counties in California authorize interlocks for both first and multiple offenders. And this has greatly increased even over the last year. However, it's still very controversial as to whether or not we should be including first offenders in interlock programs. And that is one of the questions that we will answer today. In 16 states, it's multiple offenders and first offenders with a high BAC, usually greater than or equal to 0.15%. We will also address that today. And in 13 states in the District of Columbia, it's discretionary. So in summary, 37 states require or authorize an interlock program under certain conditions, and for 13 states in the District of Columbia, it's discretionary. Well, what do we have to do in order to get authorization for an interlock program? In the United States, generally we have 3 federal branches of government, and this is replicated at each state level. But we have a legislative branch, which is responsible for writing the laws. So a state that has authorization for an interlock program, it generally starts with the legislative branch passing a law that authorizes their use. The executive branch, which includes the DMVs and MVAs in the United States, are responsible for carrying out the laws of the legislative branch. And the judicial branch guides whether or not the law that was passed and the way that it was implemented passed constitutional muster. So really we have all 3 branches involved when it comes to attacking alcohol-impaired driving. The legislative branch in terms of writing the laws, the executive branch in terms of carrying them out, and the judicial branch making sure that the laws and what we do are constitutional. Well, what are first offender beliefs? There's a general consensus among most people that the legislative and judicial branches of the United States consider first offenders simply those social drinkers who this was just an arrest when a conviction was just a single isolated event, that perhaps they're nothing more than a social drinker. They drank above the legal limit just this one time, drove home, were caught, and all they need is education. And I found a cartoon that sort of summarizes the feelings among the judicial system. This cartoon appeared in the Montgomery County, Maryland Gazette. First-time drunk drivers in Montgomery counties, and you see the judge saying, "Next time I'll slap the other one." Many people really believe that first offenders and even some multiple offenders simply receive a slap on the wrist and do not take the alcohol-impaired driving problem seriously. Well, this brings up, why study first offenders if everyone knows that first offenders are not a problem? Well, I think the reason I'm going to go over the rationale for why Tom and I decided to investigate first offenders. If you look at the empirical evidence out there, the probability of arrest, an alcohol-impaired person can drive 200 to 2,000 times before being arrested once. These studies are all scientifically valid, and they have been replicated by independent researchers over and over, including Borkenstein, Vidal, Vos, Hinkson, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and many others. So this is commonly accepted that the probability of arrest, much less a conviction, which is even a higher odd, is very, very low. So in a sense, an alcohol-impaired driver learns to drink and drive. So on the Saturday night that driver drives home and kills someone alcohol-impaired, it's reasonable to understand that he thought he could drive safely home, because it's likely that on hundreds, if not thousands of occasions, he's repeated that same behavior. So why wouldn't they think that they could drive home safely? You also look at empirical evidence from Virginia, where 2 sobriety checkpoints that were conducted, studies by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. In 1986, sobriety checkpoints missed 55% of drivers that were above or equal to 0.10%, which was the standard level in 1986. The way the study was conducted is that police officers did a normal sobriety checkpoint as they would always do, and researchers downstream would siphon the drivers over into by cones, and they were asked to provide a breath alcohol sample after the officer had let them through the roadblock, but the results of the blood alcohol concentration test or the breath test would not be available to the researchers. It simply would be recorded for later analysis. And obviously we had to do this for ethical reasons and also in order to get a high participation rate. And the participation rate on this one was quite high. Over 90% of the drivers agreed to provide a breath sample. They also missed 76% of drivers, or 3 out of 4, that had BACs between 0.05% and 0.099%. Well, almost all research needs to be replicated. So in 1995, the study was replicated in the same general area. And here the officers did much better because there was a lot of research on clues and tips that helped officers determine how to spot alcohol-impaired drivers. But in 1995, the officers still missed about 45% of drivers with BACs greater than or equal to 0.10%, and they still missed about 3 out of 4 drivers with BACs between 0.05% and 0.099%. So in a sense, even if a driver drives above the legal limit, and he does it many hundreds, if not thousands of times, even going through sobriety roadside checks, it does not mean they're going to be arrested. And in fact, they may even learn that they can go through a sobriety checkpoint alcohol impaired and not get caught. Well, if you continue looking at the evidence as to why first offenders should be studied and what has been known about them, there are similarities between first offender and multiple offenders, although there are also many characteristics that are different between the two groups. In about 2000, Jones and others evaluated the state of knowledge with regard to alcohol-impaired driving research. And I quote Jones, "With respect to the characteristics of repeat DWI offenders, we conclude that such offenders share many of the characteristics of first offenders, and that some studies have in fact found no first offender group that was distinguishable from a repeat offender group." They went on to say an unexpected finding on repeat offender characteristics was the relatively small practical difference in the mean BAC among first offenders compared to multiple offenders, a 0.18% versus a 0.16% respectively. So this empirical research says that a high BAC is not the marker. So those programs that only look at first offenders with high BACs are missing the mark. A high BAC is not the marker. Well, that brings up the question, why not? And the answer is, if we put everybody that's listening to this webinar in a room, and I gave you ethyl alcohol to drink at certain levels, your response to that alcohol is going to be based on your gender, on your weight, whether you're male or female, to some extent to your past drinking history, to your tolerance to alcohol, to the quantity of alcohol dehydrogenase that you have, and many other physiological factors. But what you will not react to in that room when you're drinking the ethyl alcohol is what your driver history is. So it's absolutely absurd to base laws on a high BAC among first offenders, because your reaction to ethyl alcohol is strictly a function of your physiology. It has nothing to do with your driver record at all. Perrine went on to say most first offenders are problem drinkers who have simply not yet had their second offense. And I would say that this research is consistent with Borkenstein, Beitelbos, Hinkson, and others with regard to the probability of arrest. Well, other than the comparison of the DACs, we did not find a lot of empirical evidence regarding first offenders. I did find one study that was conducted in Quincy, Massachusetts by Judge Albert Kramer, who finally admitted that yes, the judicial system does believe that alcohol-impaired drivers, especially first offenders, are not a problem drinker. Now, DSM-4, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, does not really define a problem drinker. But a problem drinker in this study was equivalent to what DSM-4 would say is alcohol dependent. But in general, Judge Kramer, speaking on behalf of judiciary in his state, was saying that they really felt that first offenders were generally law-abiding, they were just an overindulging social drinker, that they only need education and can be reasoned with on a rational basis. So he decided to investigate these assumptions using empirical data. And let's take a look at what he found. He ordered court clinical evaluations for all first offenders that were convicted of drunk driving that passed through his courtroom. This was a total of 1,252 first offenders. So it certainly has the power to determine what is really going on among these first offenders. He ordered two-day evaluations that were conducted by 3 of the leading alcohol treatment centers in New England. And what those treatment agencies found was that 1,032 of the 1,252 offenders that came through his courtroom were assessed as alcoholics or problem drinkers. So in other words, about 8 out of 10 first offenders that came through his courtroom, even though they were cited as being a first offender, were really alcohol dependent, or in this case, problem drinkers. And again, DSM-4 does not define alcoholics or a problem drinker, but this is the terminology that was used in his study. And likewise, only 221 or 18% were assessed as social drinkers. This is not a surprise finding. Well,